The morning of the inquiry had come in cold and gray. The kind of gray that pressed against the mullioned windows of Morphin's old courtroom and made the candles on the justice's table look smaller than they were. Dorothy had arrived before most of the assembled gentry, which she had not intended. She had simply found that she could not sleep, and that lying awake in the lodging-house listening to the wind in the eaves was worse than dressing in the dark and walking the half-mile through wet grass to the hall where her father's name would be decided. She stood now at the petitioner's position, a narrow strip of floor before the long oak table where the Earl of Morphin sat with his 2 assessors and a clerk who had already spilled ink on his register and blotted it badly. The room was full. It was a small county, and her father's estate, small as it was, had been a sufficient curiosity to bring out the local families on a Tuesday morning. She could feel their attention on her back like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades, not quite a shove. Lord Morphin had not looked at her since she entered. He was a tall man, lean in the way that suggested he had been larger once, and had burned the weight off in some private discipline. 34, perhaps, or near it. He had dark hair that he wore simply, and a jaw that the morning light from the north window rendered as something near severity. He had been reading from a document since she took her place, and he continued to read from it, and the slight movement of his eyes across the page was the most mobile thing about him. Sir Gerald Cottam sat to the left of the room, not at the table, but positioned where he could see both the petitioner and the Earl. He was a broad man, with the comfortable posture of someone who had never been made to wait for a verdict. His daughter Constance sat at his right, her hands arranged in her lap and her profile turned just enough to be seen to advantage. She wore pale blue. She always wore pale blue. Dorothy had noticed this in the one previous occasion she had observed Miss Cottam, at the Assembly Rooms in November, where Constance had laughed at something a young officer said and shown very good teeth. Dorothy wore gray wool and her best gloves, which had been darned twice at the right thumb. Lord Morphin set down the document. He looked up, and for one moment his eyes settled on Dorothy with a quality she could not name and did not have time to examine, because in the next moment he had looked away, toward the clerk, and said in a voice that carried the length of the room without effort, "The record will show the petitioner's claim to the Vale estate has been reviewed against the codicil Sir Gerald had produced. On the 14th of November, the codicil supersedes the original will. On the evidence as presented, this inquiry finds no legal standing in Miss Vale's claim." The sound in the room was not loud. It was more like a collective settling, the way snow packs down when more snow falls on top of it. Dorothy did not move. She had known this was one of the possible outcomes. She had arranged herself to receive it. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and she breathed through her nose, and she heard from somewhere behind her left shoulder a woman's voice say to a companion in a half-whisper that carried, nevertheless, precisely as I said, "What can she expect from a common liar?" The voice was Lady Alicia Morphin, the Earl's mother. Dorothy did not turn. She would not give the room the pleasure of her turning. Lord Morphin had not looked at her again. Sir Gerald was already nodding, the particular nod of a man who has received what he paid for. She had 3 weeks to vacate. To understand how Dorothy Vale came to stand in that courtroom on a gray Tuesday in February, one must go back 9 months, to the morning in May, when her father died. Thomas Vale had been a solicitor of modest practice and considerable integrity, a widower since Dorothy was 7, a man who had worn the same coat for 11 years, because he said the wool was good and waste was a kind of moral failing. He had died of a fever that took him in 4 days, which was 4 days faster than anyone believed possible for a man so apparently durable. Dorothy had sat beside him on the 2nd day and watched him become a stranger, and on the 4th day he was gone. And she was 24 and alone in a house with 3 servants and a debt of £80 to the coal merchant, and a will that left her everything. The will had been written in her father's own hand, and witnessed by 2 men she knew, Mr. Silas Gort, the notary, and old Mrs. Pusey, who kept the house. It was filed correctly. It was not contested, not at first. For 6 months it sat in the drawer of the writing table in her father's study, while she learned to manage the coal account and dismissed all but Mrs. Pusey and continued her father's small library, and wondered what would become of her, now that the season would not have her. And the only relation she possessed was a cousin in Edinburgh, who had sent a letter of condolence, so brief it was nearly transparent. Then Sir Gerald Cottam came. He came in November, in the company of his solicitor, and he sat across from Dorothy in her father's drawing-room, and he told her with great courtesy and great confidence that a codicil existed, dated 6 weeks before her father's death, in which Thomas Vale had altered the disposition of the estate in favor of his cousin's line, which was to say in favor of Sir Gerald's claim, through a connection so attenuated, Dorothy could not follow it without a chart. She told him she had never seen such a codicil. He told her with the particular smile of a man who does not expect to be questioned, that her having seen it was not a condition of its existence. She wrote to Mr. Gort that same evening. She wrote to the 2 witnesses named on the original will. She gathered what she could. She came to Morphin Hall because the Earl of Morphin was the county's ranking justice, and the inquiry could only be convened under his authority, and she had filed her objection in the proper manner and waited to be heard. She had arrived at the hall the previous evening to complete some final papers, and it was in the entrance hall waiting, while the clerk went to find a chair, that she heard Lady Morphin speak to Miss Cottam in the adjoining drawing-room, the door slightly ajar, unaware or indifferent to the fact of a petitioner in the passage. "She will come in and say her father never signed it," Lady Morphin said, "and Gerald will produce the document, and Morphin will rule correctly and it will be finished. She is a common liar, and the inquiry will make that plain." Constance had said something Dorothy could not hear. Lady Morphin's reply was a single dismissive sound, not quite a word. Dorothy had stood in the passage and she had felt the phrase land in her chest like a stone dropped from a window, not shattering but simply settling into the dark water of everything she had feared about this morning. She touched the ribbon at her throat, through the fabric of her bodice, where her father's seal ring hung on a cord she had put there the morning after he died, and had not removed since the silver was warm from her skin. She had found her chair and sat and waited, and told herself she had not expected anything else. The morning session lasted 2 hours and 7 minutes. Dorothy knew this because there was a clock on the wall above the east window, and she had counted its movements as the evidence was presented and the assessors consulted their notes, and Lord Morphin asked questions that were precise and apparently fair, and yet never, not once, produced the outcome of asking her what she knew. She was not called to speak. Sir Gerald produced the codicil. A man Dorothy did not know attested to witnessing it. Another man, equally unknown to her, confirmed the date. The document was examined and pronounced to be in Thomas Vale's hand, which it was not, which Dorothy knew with a certainty that had no legal weight unless she could establish it, and the morning session had ended before she was given the opportunity to try. When the room broke for recess, she did not leave. She stood at the petitioner's position and waited while the assembled families rose and spoke in low voices and moved toward the corridor, and she watched Sir Gerald receive Lord Fenwick's handshake and Miss Cottam accept a compliment from one of the assessor's wives. And she stood very still and did not move, because she did not know where else to go, and she had nowhere to be that was not here. Lord Morphin had risen from the table and spoken briefly with his clerk, and then he turned, and for the first time that morning he looked at her directly, not past her, at her. The quality of his attention was like a change in air pressure, sudden and specific, and she felt it in her hands before she felt it in her face. He crossed to where she stood. He stopped at a proper distance, close enough to speak without being overheard by the last of the departing families. "Miss Vale," he said. His voice in private was lower than it had been from the table. "Wait in the anteroom. The door on the left." She read it as dismissal. She nearly said so. She looked at his face and found it unreadable. The jaw set, the eyes, the color of deep water where the light does not reach the bottom. And she thought he was telling her to remove herself so the room did not have to look at her. "I have nowhere pressing to be," she said. "The anteroom," he said again. "There is a fire there, and tea." He turned away before she could reply. She went to the anteroom. She was halfway through the door when she heard behind her the sound of him speaking again to someone. Very low, in a tone that was different from his court voice, less certain of its own authority, and she could not make out the words, and she did not turn. She went in. The fire was there, the tea was there, brought by a footman who said nothing, and set it down and left. Dorothy sat in the chair nearest the hearth, and poured a cup and held it with both hands, and let the warmth come through the thin fabric of her gloves, and tried to determine what she felt. The door was ajar. She had not closed it fully, from some instinct she could not name. Through the gap she could hear the sound of the main room, the low voices, the movement of chairs. She was not attending to it, not precisely, until she heard two voices in the corridor just outside, one of which she recognized as belonging to the young footman who had brought her tea. Half the room said it before breakfast. The footman was saying to someone she could not see. "Common liar, that's what they're calling her." The other voice murmured something. "Doesn't matter what she says," the footman said. "Matters already decided." Dorothy set down her cup very carefully. She reached through the neck of her bodice and drew out the ribbon, and looked at her father's ring. Silver, old, the crest worn nearly smooth. He had worn it on the small finger of his right hand for as long as she could remember, and in the last year it had grown loose, and he had taken to carrying it in his waistcoat pocket. And when she found it there after his death, she had thought, "This is what I have." This and the truth. The truth had not performed well this morning. She sat for a long time listening to the fire. She was still sitting when she heard from the half-open door of what she thought was a cupboard, or perhaps an inner office, a small voice say very quietly, "I don't want to go back in there." Dorothy looked up. A child stood in the far doorway, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, in a brown dress and a cap that had gone slightly sideways. Her face was the particular white of a child who has been trying very hard not to cry, and has been succeeding for longer than she should have had to. "Are you Mrs. Pusey's granddaughter?" Dorothy said. The child nodded. She had Mrs. Pusey's wide-set eyes and Mrs. Pusey's directness, which she was currently deploying in the service of not entering a room that frightened her. "Eliza," Dorothy said, "come and sit with me. You do not have to go back in until I do." The child came and sat, and Dorothy found a biscuit in the pocket of her cloak that she had placed there that morning, in case she needed something to hold and had forgotten to eat, and she gave it to Eliza without ceremony, and Eliza accepted it with the gravity of a diplomat accepting a treaty. They sat together and Eliza ate the biscuit and Dorothy looked at the fire, and after several minutes, Eliza said, "They say your papa is dead." "He is," Dorothy said. "Mine also," Eliza said. "He was Mrs. Pusey's son." Dorothy looked at her. "I am sorry," she said. "Truly, grandmother says he was a good man," Eliza said. "That's what she says when she means she misses him." The fire settled. Dorothy put her arm around the child, very gently, not quite an embrace, and Eliza leaned against her with the uncomplicated trust of a child who has not yet learned to withhold it. Neither of them saw the door to the corridor, open by a half-inch. Neither of them heard the slight pause in the sound of footsteps outside. Lord Morphin stood in the corridor for perhaps 30 seconds. He stood with his hand flat against the doorframe, not pushing, not pulling, simply resting there in the manner of a man who has stopped in the middle of a deliberate motion and cannot yet determine whether to complete it. Through the gap he could see the firelight moving on the wall behind them, and the dark wool of Dorothy's sleeve, and Eliza's cap gone sideways, and the steadiness of Dorothy's posture, which did not shift or perform, which was simply present in the way certain things are present, without asking anything from anyone who happened to be watching. He did not go in. After 30 seconds, he lifted his hand from the doorframe and walked on. He had come from the direction of his private office, where he had been sitting before his desk and looking at the portrait that hung on the wall opposite, the portrait of a fair-haired woman, who looked not quite at the viewer, but at something slightly to the viewer's left. as though she had been caught mid-thought and had consented to be painted only on those terms. He had been sitting there for 11 minutes by his pocket watch, and he had not been thinking about the inquiry or not about the legal substance of it. He had been thinking about the expression on Miss Vale's face when he delivered the finding. He had expected tears, or anger, or the particular brittle composure of someone about to faint. He had seen all of those from petitioners over 9 years as a ranking justice. What he had not expected was stillness. Not suppression, not performance. Stillness. The kind that comes from having prepared oneself so thoroughly for the worst that its arrival is not a surprise, but a completion. He had seen that once before, in a woman who stood in a room he had made cold by his withdrawal from it, and who had looked at him with that particular stillness, and who had not been there in the morning. He made himself look at the portrait when the thought came to him like that. He made himself count the cost. He had believed the thing that was told him about Catherine. He had not asked her. He had administered a silence so complete it had spoken in its own voice, and what it had said had been worse than whatever lie his informant had planted. He knew now what had been done to him, and he knew now what he had done with it. There was no remedy for that knowledge. One carried it, or one did not. The document Sir Gerald had produced was very good. The handwriting was close. The witnesses were credible. And yet Lord Morphin had sat at the table and felt, beneath the legal machinery of the morning, something he could not name that pressed against the certification of the finding. He had been told once before that the evidence was clear. He had believed it, without asking the person most qualified to speak. He walked past the anteroom and down the corridor and did not stop. And in the anteroom Dorothy held the child against her side, and the fire burned lower and neither of them moved. The afternoon session was called at 3 o'clock. The families filed back in with the particular energy of people who believe the conclusion is foregone and are here for the formality of its being spoken aloud. Dorothy returned to the petitioner's position. She stood as she had stood that morning, gloved hands at her sides, the ribbon hidden under her bodice, the ring warm against her sternum. Sir Gerald did not waste time. He rose and addressed the Earl with the deference of a man performing deference for an audience rather than meaning it. And he produced from his solicitor's satchel 3 letters, sealed and then opened, which he said were in Thomas Vale's hand, and which spoke to his father's intention to disinherit his daughter in favor of the larger family claim. He said the letters had been discovered only recently among his own correspondence. Received in the months before Thomas Vale's illness, he said they corroborated the codicil in every particular. Lord Morphin examined the letters. He passed them to his assessors. He looked up, and his expression told Dorothy nothing. She touched the ribbon through her bodice. Sir Gerald had turned from the table to face the room. He spread his hands. Miss Vale has maintained throughout this proceeding that the codicil is false, and that her father's testament was the document she has presented. I ask the Assembly to consider the weight of evidence. Against a young woman of no independent standing, her late father's word and her own testimony. He let his voice rest on that phrase a moment, letting the Assembly fill in what it implied. We have the codicil, witnessed. We have 3 letters, in his hand. What we have from Miss Vale is her word alone. I ask his lordship to complete the ruling and allow this matter to conclude. She is a common liar, he added almost as an afterthought, to no one in particular to the room, as a man releases a stone from a window because he can. Dorothy heard the phrase land for the 3rd time, and she felt it differently than she had the first 2. The first time in the passage, it had been unexpected, and it had gone to the dark place in her chest where all the worst assessments of herself had gathered since childhood. The second time, through the corridor door, it had been the room's verdict, reported back to her confirming what she had suspected. The third time, it hit something that was not the dark place. It hit something adjacent to anger that she had not known. She possessed until that moment, something that ran along the bones of her hands and steadied them. She raised her voice clearly. Without heat, without volume beyond what the room required. "My lord," she said, "I would speak." The room turned to look at her. Lord Morphin looked at her. His expression, she thought, shifted by a fraction. Something moving beneath the surface of it like a current under ice. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Proceed, Miss Vale." She did not begin with an accusation. She did not begin with her own suffering or her own claim or the injustice of the morning. She began with her father. Thomas Vale was a solicitor for 29 years, she said. He was meticulous in his professional practice. He wrote in a particular hand, and the particular thing about that hand was that he formed his lowercase letter e with a closed loop, without exception, because he had been taught by a schoolmaster who was very firm on this point. He spoke of this schoolmaster with great affection until the end of his life. Every letter he wrote, every document he drafted, every notation in his register, closes that letter in exactly the same manner. She reached into her bodice and drew out the ribbon. The ring came with it, small and silver, the crest barely visible, and she held it up briefly, so the room could see it, and then she set it on the petitioner's table in front of her. "This was his ring," she said. "He left it in his waistcoat pocket when he died. I have carried it since. I am not presenting it as legal evidence. I am presenting it because I want you to understand that I am not speaking about a stranger. I knew him. I knew his hand. The codicil Sir Gerald has produced forms. The lowercase e with an open loop. I noticed this the first time I saw the document in November, and I said nothing because I thought no one would believe me, and I was correct. I was not believed. The room was very quiet. The 3 letters Sir Gerald has produced," she continued, "are not in my father's hand for the same reason. They are very good. Whoever copied his correspondence was careful and talented. The E is open in every one. I have here for the Assembly's examination 6 letters and 2 legal documents in my father's actual hand, drawn from the files in his office, which Mr. Silas Gort can confirm he produced from the practices archive 3 days ago. Mr. Brandt, Gort, who had been sitting against the wall with the particular silence of a man who has been told to sit against the wall and say nothing, lifted his head. "I can confirm it," he said, without waiting to be asked. "I would also call Mrs. Ballum." "Ruth Pusey," Dorothy said, "who witnessed my father's original will and who was present in this house when he died, and who has in her possession a letter he wrote to her the week before his death, which she has carried since, and which has the same hand and the same closed E, and which she can produce now." Mrs. Pusey rose from the back of the room. She was a small woman in a dark dress, and she walked to the front with the particular steadiness of someone who has already decided that she is not afraid of this room or anything in it. The sound of her feet on the floorboards was very clear in the quiet the room had become. People watched her walk, and in watching her walk they were already making the calculation Dorothy had been waiting all day for them to make. If you have been wondering when the truth was going to arrive with enough weight to be felt, it arrived in the sound of Mrs. Pusey's footsteps crossing that floor. "Stay with us." She placed the letter on the table beside Dorothy's ring. Dorothy did not look at Lord Morphin. She looked at the room. The room was looking back at her. There was a long pause. It was not empty. It was the kind of pause in which a great many recalculations are being made simultaneously and quietly. Lord Fenwick, who had shaken Sir Gerald's hand at the recess, had moved slightly away from Sir Gerald. 2 of the assessors' wives were whispering together. Miss Cottam had turned her face toward her father, and her father's face had lost its comfortable certainty, and what replaced it was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something that belonged to both. Lord Morphin rose. He had not made a sound. He simply stood, and the room attended to him immediately and completely, the way rooms do, when the person who stands is genuinely the authority in it, rather than merely the one who has been performing it. He took the letters, Sir Gerald's and Dorothy's both. He took them to the window where the remaining light of the afternoon came through, the glass, gray and precise. He looked at one and then the other. He looked for a considerable time. No one spoke. Then he turned to face the room. "Miss Vale's testimony stands," he said. "Sir Gerald, your evidence does not. The silence after those words was the fullest silence Dorothy had ever stood inside. She felt it press against her eardrums the way deep water does. "My lord." "I must protest," Sir Gerald said. His voice had changed. The comfort had gone out of it. Lord Morphin looked at him. "Mr. Daffer." "Gort," he said. "You will secure the archive documents for formal examination. The assessors will prepare a full comparison report." He turned back to Sir Gerald. "You will present yourself to this inquiry again in a fortnight, with any additional evidence you believe supports your claim. I advise you to consult counsel." Sir Gerald looked at Lord Fenwick. Lord Fenwick had taken another small step away from him, and was examining his own coat buttons with great interest. Miss Cottam stood. She gathered her gloves from her lap and her bag, and she left the room without speaking to her father. She did not look at Dorothy. She simply went, and the door did not quite close behind her, and the gap let in a current of cold corridor air. Within a quarter of an hour they had all gone. The Gentry families, the assessors, Lady Morphin, who rose with great dignity, and left without speaking to anyone. Sir Gerald, whose solicitor spoke quietly to him at the door, in a tone that carried urgency if not specificity. The clerk, the footman, the woman who had spoken in the corridor that morning about common liars. Mrs. Pusey took Dorothy's hands between her own for a moment and said nothing, and then collected her letter from the table and went to find Eliza, who was waiting in the corridor with a second biscuit she had located from an unknown source. Dorothy stood at the petitioner's table and looked at her father's ring and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was very tired and very cold and that she would like, very much, to go home. "Miss Vale?" She turned. Lord Morphin stood in the doorway. He had his coat on, which meant he had been to his office, and he held nothing in his hands. The candles on the justice's table had been lit at some point during the afternoon, and they were burning in the empty room, small and steady in the gray evening air. He crossed to where she stood. He stopped close to her. Not at the proper distance. Closer than propriety called for, not so close as to require explanation, but close enough that she could see the change in his face that she had been trying to read all day, the thing that had moved beneath the surface of his expression since the morning. He looked at her father's ring on the table. "May I?" he said. It was not quite a question. She did not move the ring. She watched his hand come down and pick it up, not cradling it but holding it the way someone holds a thing they understand the weight of. Between the first finger and thumb, he examined the crest, which was nearly smooth. "He wore it a long time," Dorothy said. "Yes," Lord Morphin said. He set it down again, but he did not step back. She was very aware all at once of how close he was standing, of the warmth that came off a person in a cold room, of the fact that she had been cold for most of this day and had grown accustomed to it, and now she was not, and the not cold was disconcerting. "I was wrong this morning," he said. He said it in the same voice he used for all his declarative sentences, level and without excess, as though he had decided what needed to be said and had simply said it. She said nothing. She had not expected him to say it. "I ruled on evidence I had not adequately examined," he said. "I have no argument for it. I do not ask you to excuse it." Dorothy looked at his face. The severity she had read as hostility in the morning was still there, but she could see now that it was not directed outward. It pressed inward, against something she could not name from the outside. "You ruled correctly on what you had," she said, because it was true, and she was committed to saying what was true. "I ruled on what I was given," he said, "rather than on what I might have sought. Those are not the same." She understood, in the particular way one understands something, that belongs to a longer story than the one in front of you, that he was not only speaking about this morning. She did not say so. He was still looking at her. The candles on the table were very small against the size of the room, but they were sufficient, and in their light she could see that his hands, which were at his sides, had not moved, but that one of them, the right one, had shifted very slightly, a fraction, toward her and stopped. I want to understand what happened to your father, he said. Not as an inquiry prefatory statement, as something else. I will tell you, she said. All of it. Not tonight. No, he said. Not tonight. He picked up her father's ring from the table and held it out to her. She took it from his palm and their fingers did not touch, but the space between them was close enough that she felt the warmth of his hand against the back of hers for the brief moment of the transfer. She put the ring on the ribbon. She put the ribbon around her neck. He was still standing close to her. You should not walk back to the lodging house alone, he said. The road is wet. She nearly told him she had walked it that morning. She nearly told him she was perfectly capable. Tav. She looked at his face instead, at the tension in the jaw that she was beginning to read, not as coldness, but as the discipline of a man who was used to controlling whatever space he stood in, and was in this moment not quite controlling it. No, she said. Perhaps not. He called for the carriage. 2 months later, in the 3rd week of April, Dorothy sat in the morning room of what had been her father's house, and was now legally and conclusively hers. The inquiry had resolved in her favor on the 1st day of March, the formal comparison report having found the disputed documents to be forgeries of considerable skill, but certain provenance. Sir Gerald had departed the county, which was one of those outcomes that arranges itself so neatly. It looks engineered, though no one could quite say by whom. Mrs. Pusey had returned to the house, and was in the kitchen at this moment, from the sound of it, engaged in some activity involving a great deal of purposeful movement. Eliza was in the garden. Dorothy was not reading the letter in her lap. What? She had read it 3 times. Already. It was from Lord Morphin, and it was characteristically short, and it said what it needed to say without ornamentation, and what it said was that he intended to call on her this morning, if she was willing, and that he had something he wished to say to her that he had not said, on the evening of the inquiry or in any of the 4 occasions on which they had spoken since, and that he would understand if she preferred he did not come. She had not replied to it. She had thought about replying to it. She had written 3 beginnings of replies and torn them up because they all said in different ways the same thing, which was, "Come." She heard the carriage on the road at 10:20. She did not go to the window. She sat in the morning room chair, and she listened to the knock at the door, and to Mrs. Otis Pusey's tread in the hall, and to the low exchange of voices, and then to the footstep in the passage that was not Mrs. Pusey's. And then he was in the doorway. He looked, in the April light, less severe than he had in the courtroom. Or perhaps, she now knew where the severity lived and could see past it to what lay behind it. He had his hat in his hand. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She rose. Lord Morphin, she said. I had a wife, he said, and then stopped, and looked out the window at the garden where Eliza was crouching, to examine something in the grass. I told myself for a long time that what happened to her was not my fault. I was told something about her that was not true. I believed it without asking her. I do not believe this absolves me. I withdrew from her, and she did not survive the winter, and I have carried that knowledge for 3 years. And Upcher. He looked back at Dorothy. I told you that I ruled on what I was given, rather than on what I might have sought. I want you to understand that I have applied that standard to more than the inquiry. She was very still. I have no plan to offer you, he said. I have no speech prepared. I am not a man who speaks well about this sort of thing. What I can tell you is that I know what I see when I look at you, which is not what the room saw that morning, and that I have known it since the recess and probably before that, and that I am asking you to allow me to know you better, if you are willing, and if you can tolerate a man who has made the error of believing testimony over the person who deserved to be asked. The morning room was very quiet. From outside came the sound of Eliza talking to something in the grass very earnestly. Dorothy felt the ring against her sternum, warm from her skin. Dorothy, he said her given name in his voice for the first time. Not a question. Not a petition, but the way a man says a word when he has been holding it in reserve. and has finally determined that the moment has arrived to put it down. "Tell me whether I should go." She did not tell him to go. She crossed the room, she stopped before him, and she looked up at his face, which was not composed in the way it had been composed in the courtroom. It was open in the way a man's face is open when he has decided not to protect it any longer. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, gloved the darned thumb at the corner of his mouth, and held it there. He covered her hand with his fingers warm through the thin cotton, and held it there also. Outside, Eliza had found a snail, and was narrating its properties to the garden with great authority. Mrs. Pusey's industry in the kitchen had quieted to something steady and unhurried. April light came through the morning room window, pale and particular, the kind that comes in the middle of the morning, when the day has made up its mind to be fair. Dorothy felt him turn his head very slightly, his lips at the back of her gloved hand, and she thought of her father's ring, and of the morning in the courtroom, and of Mrs. Pusey's footsteps crossing the floor, and she thought, this is what quiet courage is for, not the grand occasion, not the single answering speech for this morning, for this room, for being willing to receive what you had not dared to want. She wore the ring on her finger now, and had done since that evening, in the empty courtroom, when she had walked to the carriage he had summoned and had felt, in the particular quality of his silence beside her, that something had shifted that would not shift back. She had moved the ring from the ribbon to the small finger of her right hand, the way her father had worn it, and it sat there, slightly loose, still a little cold in the morning air before the room warmed, but present, openly present, not hidden under a bodice, not tucked against a sternum as a private proof of her right to be here. It had been her father's. Now it was hers. She wore it, and the morning knew it, and the man standing in the light of the window knew it, and it needed no court to confirm what was plainly true. Thank you for staying until the end. If Dorothy's reply moved you, leave a word below, and we will see you again.